Her family mocked her for being unmarried at 30. Then the royal prince chose her. Over the Princess Autumn did not arrive at Ashmore House that year so much as it descended, a creditor arriving early, demanding payment in warmth and light. By the first week of October, the fires in the lesser rooms had been reduced to suggestions, and the candles in the corridor sconces were replaced only every other day rather than each morning as they once had been. The house felt it, the way old houses always do. The walls seemed to lean inward slightly, the hallways narrowing against the cold, and the great portrait of the late Sir Edmund Whitmore in the entrance hall wore an expression that had never quite been cheerful, but now seemed positively grim. It was into this diminishing world that Eleanor Whitmore woke each morning, dressed without the help of a maid, Cecily's maid, not hers, and descended the stairs to oversee whatever could still be overseen. She was 30 years old in a world that had stopped counting at 25. Her hair was the colour of autumn itself, dark and unremarkable, and she wore it pinned without fuss, without the elaborate curls that Cecily spent an hour constructing each morning with the patient labour of a girl named Prue, who was paid to find beauty wherever she could. Eleanor's dresses were dove grey and lavender, and a particular shade of blue that was closer to cloud than sky, colours chosen initially for their economy, and worn now with something approaching resignation, though she would not have called it that. She would have called it practicality. She was, above all things, practical. She had been practical since the age of 12, which was when she had first noticed that practicality was the one currency she could reliably earn and spend without anyone's permission. Beauty was Cecily's, charm was Cecily's, the long admiring looks of the neighbours' sons, the whispered debates in church pews about whose complexion was finer this season, the cluster of admirers at the midsummer dance, all of it Cecily's, and rightly so, and Eleanor had long since stopped attending the midsummer dance with any particular expectation. She went when she went, in the grey dress, and she stood near the refreshment table because the refreshment table was near the door, and she helped the older women find their cloaks at the end of the evening, and she came home unremarkable and untroubled, and told herself this was preferable to something she did not name. Her mother did not find this a compliment. "You could at least attempt the green one," Lady Whitmore said at breakfast that Tuesday, not looking up from the letter she was turning over in her hands, with the concentration of a woman hoping words might rearrange themselves. "The one from 3 seasons past. It would do. The green one has a seam coming apart at the shoulder," Eleanor said, pouring the tea with the efficiency of long habit. "I'll repair it this afternoon." "You'll repair it," her mother repeated, with the particular tone that transformed ordinary statements into small condemnations. Cecily arrived then, as she always did, in a sweep of rose-pink morning dress, her golden hair perfectly arranged, her colour high and pretty and utterly effortless in the way that made older women sigh and younger ones despair. She was 24 and radiant, and the subject of every conversation Eleanor's mother had managed to introduce the word marriage into for the past 6 years. She dropped into her chair with a laugh about nothing in particular and reached for the toast. "The Prince's household has written again," Lady Whitmore said, and the table went still. Eleanor set down the teapot carefully. The Prince. Cecily said it the way one says the name of something half believed in, a rumour given sudden, astonishing weight. His Royal Highness Prince Edmund Callaway. Lady Whitmore placed the letter on the table with the deliberateness of someone laying down a winning hand. "His household has written to Sir Gerald 3 times in the past fortnight. Gerald says the Prince is in earnest. He requires—" She paused, consulting the letter again, though Eleanor suspected she had committed it entirely to memory. "He requires a wife, quietly and quickly. Something about the terms of his late father's estate, a condition of assuming full governance of the Northern Territories. He must be married by the end of the season, or the matter reverts to Parliament's administration." She looked at Cecily. Gerald says the prince himself suggested our family." "Our family?" Cecily repeated, and she smiled the slow smile of someone who had always known this was coming. Eleanor drank her tea and said nothing. It was not that she had no thoughts. She had a great many thoughts, arranged in careful order as she arranged most things. She simply knew that the thoughts most worth having were often the ones least worth speaking aloud in this particular room. The days that followed were a studied ceremony of exclusion. Her mother drafted correspondence with Sir Gerald Ashmore, their distant cousin who served in some advisory capacity to the royal household, and she drafted it at the writing desk in the morning room, with the door half closed, which was as close to privacy as the house permitted. Cecily was fitted for new gowns at an expense Eleanor could calculate to the pound simply by noting which household accounts her mother avoided discussing. The rose garden, half wild and largely untended since the gardener's retirement 2 seasons past, was ordered trimmed, at least the portion visible from the drawing-room window, where any visiting party might glimpse it from the lane. Eleanor continued to manage the household. She spoke with cook about stretching the remaining stores through winter. She wrote 3 letters on behalf of her mother, who found correspondence fatiguing. She mended the green dress and placed it in Cecily's wardrobe, where it would fit better and matter more. She was thanked for none of this, which surprised no one, least of all Eleanor. She had learned over 30 years to make herself useful in the way that furniture is useful, indispensable and unremarkable, noticed only in the event of its absence. It was on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October that Prince Edmund Callaway came to Ashmore House. He came without ceremony, a single dark carriage, 2 men who stood at the gate and said nothing, and the prince himself, who was not what the village had imagined. The village had imagined someone golden, perhaps, someone theatrical. He was neither. He was tall in the way that suggested it had never been something he thought about, dark-haired, and possessed of an austerity that had nothing performative about it. His face was angular and still, with eyes the colour of a winter sky, not the grey of storm clouds precisely, but the grey of the hour before dawn, when the world is neither dark nor light, and holds its breath. He was, Eleanor thought, from the upstairs landing where she had stopped with an armful of mended linens, a man who looked as though he had been quietly carrying something very heavy for a very long time. He greeted her mother in the drawing-room. Eleanor heard the voices without hearing the words. She went back to her work. It was not until she came downstairs for the household accounts — the study was the only room with a suitable desk that was not currently occupied — that she encountered him. He was standing in the corridor outside the study door, very still, apparently examining the portrait of her grandfather that hung there in its slightly tilted frame. He did not seem to notice her approach, and she had come close enough to be awkward before she registered that the corridor was not hers alone. She said, "The frame has been crooked for 11 years. My father always meant to have it straightened." He turned. The grey eyes found her with the particular attention of someone who was accustomed to people arranging themselves for his notice, and was therefore surprised to find someone who had simply walked into the corridor with an armful of account ledgers and spoken plainly. "Did he?" The prince said. "He was a great one for good intentions." Eleanor said, "We have several uncompleted projects in his honour." There was a silence. And then, not a smile, not quite, but the almost of one. A brief shift at the corner of his mouth, there and then gone, as though he had caught himself at something unscheduled. "You are not Miss Cecily Whitmore," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "I am the other one." He studied her for a moment longer than courtesy strictly required. Then he inclined his head very slightly, and stepped aside so she might pass. She went into the study, set down her ledgers, and did not look back. She did not know then that he remained in the corridor for a full minute after she had gone, looking at the crooked portrait and thinking thoughts he would not have been able to name precisely, only that they had the quality of something beginning. She did not know that he had come downstairs not by accident, but because he had heard, from the drawing-room where he'd been subjected to 40 minutes of Cecily's performances, the careful laugh, the artful display of accomplishments, a sound that was entirely different. A door, a quiet, purposeful step. The small, self-contained efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be and was getting there without asking permission. She did not know that he had watched from the drawing-room doorway, as she paused at the foot of the stairs to set down her ledgers and free one hand long enough to straighten a small vase of wilting chrysanthemums on the hall table, not because anyone would notice, but because they were leaning. Because it was a small wrong thing that could be made right, and she was constitutionally incapable of walking past those. He had stood there, one hand braced on the doorframe, and watched her do this entirely unobserved thing. And something in him, wound tight for years against sentiment, had shifted the smallest possible degree, the way a door shifts on its hinge in a change of weather. Barely perceptible, but no longer quite closed. He made his decision in that corridor before she had spoken a single word. He confirmed it in those few exchanged sentences, and he went back to the drawing-room and informed Lady Whitmore that he would like to return the following week. Cecily spent the intervening days in radiant, unquestioned certainty. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The second visit was shorter than the first. Prince Edmund arrived on a Tuesday, spoke privately with Sir Gerald, who had come down from the city for the occasion, for 20 minutes, and then joined the family in the drawing-room for tea. He was courteous to Lady Whitmore. He was pleasant, in a contained way, to Cecily. He spoke for some minutes about the northern territories he administered, the coastline, the winters, the particular quality of the light there in early spring. He asked no one's opinion about any of it, which would have struck most observers as royal prerogative, but which Eleanor, who was present in her habitual chair near the bookcase where the account ledgers were kept, recognized as something else. He was not asserting authority. He was testing for curiosity. Cecily said the northern light sounded very romantic, and inquired whether there were balls in the season. Eleanor said, without particular intention of being heard, that she understood the northern fishing industries had been struggling with the new tariff structures, and that the winter fishermen were a particular concern. The room went quiet. Cecily turned to look at her with an expression that contained, in equal measure, surprise and dismissal. Lady Whitmore's teacup paused halfway to her mouth. The prince, across the room, turned and looked at Eleanor with those winter sky eyes, and this time the assessment was entirely open, unhurried, and interested. "They are," he said. "The tariff issue has been before the Northern Council for 3 sessions. Do you have a view on how it ought to be resolved?" No one had asked Eleanor her view on anything in recent memory, save Cook on the matter of the Tuesday soup. She felt, briefly, the peculiar vertigo of being addressed directly by someone who appeared to be listening in advance, who had arranged his attention toward her answer before the answer had come. "I would think," she said carefully, "that a tiered structure based on vessel size rather than catch weight would be more equitable. Smaller operations can't absorb the same margins as the large commercial fleets." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is more or less the recommendation the Council has rejected twice." "Then the Council," Eleanor said, "has perhaps not spoken with enough fishermen." The almost smile appeared again, faster this time, and then he looked away, at some neutral middle distance, and the conversation moved on, and Cecily laughed about something, and Lady Whitmore relaxed her grip on the teacup. But Eleanor had seen it, the almost smile, and she had the unsettling, confusing, deeply inconvenient sense that it had been directed entirely at her. Sir Gerald requested a private meeting with Lady Whitmore the following morning. Eleanor was in the kitchen reviewing the store's inventory when her mother's voice reached her from the hallway. Not the words, only the register, which was high and uncertain, and nothing like the controlled satisfaction she had arranged herself to display over the past weeks. Eleanor set down the inventory list and went to find out what had happened. Her mother was standing in the entrance hall when Eleanor arrived, a letter in her hand, her face performing a series of expressions that did not quite settle into any one of them. "He has asked for you," her mother said. Eleanor was still for a moment. "I beg your pardon?" "Prince Edmund." Lady Whitmore said the name as though it were something she had found in the wrong drawer. "He has formally requested, through Sir Gerald, permission to court you, not Cecily." She looked at Eleanor as though trying to reconcile what she was seeing with a sum that would not add. "You." From upstairs, through the floor, they could both hear Cecily's voice rise briefly and then cut off. Eleanor looked at her mother. She looked at the letter. She looked at the portrait of her grandfather with its perpetually crooked frame. She thought of very little and very much simultaneously, the way one does when the world has just quietly rearranged itself. "Well," she said at last, "what does Sir Gerald advise?" Her mother's expression collapsed, just slightly, into something more honest. "He advises acceptance. The arrangement would settle the Whitmore debt entirely. And the terms—" she swallowed. "The terms are more than generous." "I see," Eleanor said. "Eleanor." Her mother paused. The pause was long enough to contain several things neither of them would say. "Do you wish to accept?" It was perhaps the first time in 30 years that her mother had asked her what she wished. She thought of the corridor, the almost smile, the grey eyes attending to her as though she had been worth attending to all along, as though she had always been there, and someone had simply, finally, looked in the right direction. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I believe I do." She was not choosing a prince. She was not choosing the settlement of debts, or the security of a household, or the silencing of a world that had spent 30 years telling her that she would come to nothing. She was choosing because, for the first time she could remember, a person of consequence had looked directly at her, and seen exactly what was there, and found it not merely sufficient, but preferable. To be chosen is one thing. To be seen and then chosen is another thing altogether. The engagement was announced without fanfare, which suited Eleanor entirely, and displeased her mother only moderately, since there was a certain pride to be taken even in a quiet announcement when the announcement concerned a royal prince. Cecily did not speak to Eleanor for 4 days, and on the 5th day appeared in the doorway of Eleanor's room with an expression that had moved through fury and landed somewhere in the vicinity of bewilderment. "Why you?" she said, genuinely curious in the way of someone confronting a puzzle that should not exist. Eleanor folded a grey dress into her travel trunk. "I haven't the faintest idea," she said, which was not entirely true, but some truths were not for sharing, particularly with people who had not yet learned to value them. The journey north took 2 days. Eleanor travelled in the prince's carriage, a conveyance of considerable quality that she spent much of the journey studying, as she studied most things, for what it might tell her about the man who owned it. It told her he was not given to excess. The interior was well made, but not gilded, the cushions good leather rather than velvet, the fittings polished and functional. There was a small book in the door pocket, a survey of northern maritime trade, extensively annotated in a cramped, precise hand. She did not read it, but she noted it and found that it confirmed something she had already suspected. Callaway Hall announced itself on the afternoon of the 2nd day, not through gates or dramatic approaches, but through weather. The sky changed first, the light going from the pale gold of autumn afternoon to something colder and cleaner, as though the air had been rinsed. Then came the sea, visible on the left, iron-grey and vast and entirely indifferent. And then the house itself, emerging from a rise in the ground as though it had grown there rather than been built. Grey stone, 3 wings, windows that caught the flat northern light and held it like collected silence. It was enormous, and it was austere, and it was, Eleanor thought with the clarity of someone accustomed to reading houses the way others read faces, profoundly lonely. She stepped out of the carriage and stood before it and looked up at it without flinching. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, met her at the door. She was a woman of 60, straight-backed and sharp-eyed, who had clearly determined in advance that she would not be charmed, deceived, or managed, and who wore this determination in the set of her jaw like armor. She showed Eleanor the house with the efficiency of someone delivering a report, and Eleanor followed her through room after room of dust-covered furniture and shut curtains and the particular chill that settles in rooms that have not been lived in, only maintained. The staff is considerably reduced from the late Duke's time, Mrs. Alderton said, as they passed through what had evidently once been a music room, the pianoforte sheeted in white. His Royal Highness prefers the smaller household. The smaller household or the quieter one? Eleanor asked. Mrs. Alderton looked at her sidelong. The latter, I suppose, she said, after a moment. I see, said Eleanor, and she meant it. The garden was the last thing she was shown, or rather the last thing she found on her own the following morning, when she rose before the household and followed a door she had noticed the previous afternoon, half hidden behind a tapestry that needed airing, and emerged into the northern light to find, behind a stone wall, what had once been a rose garden. It was entirely overgrown. The canes had crossed each other in years of unguided growth, and the beds had collapsed into themselves, and a stone bench in the corner had acquired a coat of moss that suggested seasons of patient waiting. It smelled still very faintly of roses, the ghost of a perfume clinging to dead wood and cold earth. Eleanor stood in it for a long time, her breath clouding in the morning air. Then she went back inside, found Mrs. Alderton, and asked for a pair of heavy gloves. The transformation of Callaway Hall was not a campaign. It was not conducted with purpose or announced with intention. It was simply what Eleanor did, because she could not see a cold room without wondering what warmth would cost, or a dust-sheeted piece of furniture without imagining it uncovered, or a small wrong thing without being compelled, quietly and without fuss, to make it right. She began with the fires. Not an extravagance of fires. She had no authority over the household accounts yet, and would not have presumed, but a recalibration of where the existing fires were laid. The servants' hall, she noted, was being heated by a grate that was drawing badly. A simple adjustment to the flue, and the warmth it produced was half again as much. Cook's kitchen had a secondary hearth that had been closed off, for reasons no one currently on staff could recall. Eleanor had it opened, and the kitchen became livable in a way that produced, from Cook, a gratitude entirely without precedent. She learned the names of every member of the staff within the first 4 days, all 11 of them. Mrs. Alderton observed this phenomenon from a distance, with the expression of someone who has not yet decided what to make of a thing, but is watching carefully. Thomas the gardener, who had not been asked his opinion of anything in 6 seasons, found himself consulted one November morning about the frost schedule and the state of the ground, and he gave his opinion in the brief, precise sentences of a man unaccustomed to being heard, and Eleanor listened with the full attention she gave to everything, and thanked him, and went back inside. He watched her go with an expression that had no ready name for itself. Bess, the young maid, told the others that the new mistress had asked her what she liked to read. The others received this intelligence with a silence of shared disbelief. It was a small thing. It was what it was. Eleanor was not performing warmth or engineering loyalty or conducting a strategy. She was simply constitutionally incapable of inhabiting a space without learning its shape, and the shape of Callaway Hall included 11 people who had been going about their quiet and necessary work in a household that had stopped seeing them some time ago, and she saw them, because she always had been able to see what others looked past. The dining table was, perhaps, the most quietly eloquent gesture. The table in the great dining room could seat 40 with ease, and had been set, apparently, for every dinner the prince hosted, including private dinners, including nights when he dined alone, with himself at one end in the formal manner. Eleanor mentioned, carefully and without implication, that the round table in the smaller sitting room might be a more comfortable arrangement for two, and perhaps there was no need to heat and light the great hall for an intimate evening. She had not suggested the great table be removed. She had simply suggested an alternative. When Prince Edmund arrived on the Friday of her second week, he had been in the capital concluding parliamentary business. He found Eleanor seated at the round table in the sitting room with a lamp burning and cook's best soup and a fire laid for two. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Mrs. Alderton sent word," he said, "that there had been some changes." "Several small ones," Eleanor said. "Nothing that cannot be undone, if you prefer the other way." He came in and sat across from her, close enough at the small round table that the lamp caught the planes of his face and the grey of his eyes. And Eleanor could see for the first time that the austerity she had read in him was not coldness, but the careful architecture of a man who had learned to contain a great deal. "I do not prefer the other way," he said. She passed him the bread. They dined in silence at first, a silence that was, Eleanor found, not uncomfortable. He ate without the performance of appetite she had learned to expect from men accustomed to being watched. She did not fill the quiet with noise, which was her habit, and which seemed to be, she gradually perceived, something of a relief to him. "You've been in the garden," he said eventually. "Every morning," she said. "The roses are dormant but alive. The root structure is intact on most of them. With proper pruning in early spring, they'll come back." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother planted them," he said, "before she died." This was the first time he had mentioned the late Queen. Eleanor did not move quickly toward the opening. She was not in the habit of moving quickly toward anything. She set down her spoon and looked at him in the lamplight and waited. "I have not been in that garden," he said, "in 8 years. "I know," she said, "the moss on the bench." He looked at her with those winter sky eyes, and something in his expression moved. Not the almost smile this time, but something quieter than that, deeper, like a change in the water beneath the surface. "You read a room," he said. "I read most things," she said. "It is what one does when one is not generally spoken to." Another silence, and then carefully, "I spoke to you." "You did," she said. "I noticed." The weeks that followed had the quality of winter light, pale, clear, and surprisingly warm for the temperature. He was not, it turned out, a cold man. He was a man who had been alone for a long time and had made certain adaptations to that state, as one does, had built internal rooms and closed their doors, had learned to carry his grief and his responsibilities in the sealed chambers of himself, had grown so accustomed to speaking to no one of consequence that consequence had come to feel like the natural shape of silence. But she was there, in the morning, with her ledgers and her gloves and her plain-spoken assessments of the fishing tariffs and the flu in the servants' hall, and she asked nothing of him that he was not prepared to give, and she gave him everything she had without announcement or expectation, and he found, gradually and then with some acceleration, that the sealed chambers were less necessary than they had been. He told her about his father in the library, on a November evening when the wind off the sea had made the upper windows rattle. He told her without preamble, in the middle of a conversation about the estate records, which she had been reorganizing, that his father had loved him best when he was useful, and barely at all when he was not, and that the terms of the inheritance, the marriage condition, the parliamentary deadline, all of it, were one final instance of being made useful posthumously. He said it in a flat, even voice, the voice of a man reporting something he had long since made peace with, or tried to. He said it and then stopped, as though he had not quite planned to say it, and was mildly surprised to find it said, hanging in the warm library air between them. Eleanor did not offer sympathy in the form of soft words. She said, "I think that when people are unable to love freely, they disguise control as love, and call the thing they build a family." He looked at her. "My mother," she said by way of explanation, "loves Cecily for her beauty, and loves me for my competence, and neither of us has ever been loved simply for being present. I find it makes one very self-sufficient and very lonely in equal measure." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled in the grate. The wind found the windowsill and moved along it. Eleanor did not rush the silence or apologize for what she had said, because she had learned long ago that truths worth hearing were worth letting sit in the room for a moment before anyone decided what to do with them. She went back to the estate records and made a notation in the margin, and he watched her do this, and something in the watching had the quality of a man rediscovering a room he had walled off and finding it, unexpectedly, still habitable. "She died in that garden," he said quietly after a time. Not a non sequitur. She understood he meant his mother. "It was spring. I was 14. I came back from my lessons and found her there on the stone bench, as though she had simply decided to rest for a moment and had not woken up." A pause. "The doctors called it her heart. I believe they were correct. I believe her heart had been under considerable strain for some years." Another pause, longer. "My father had the garden closed. He said it was out of grief. I was 14, and I believed him. I am considerably older now." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at him across the lamplight, and she felt the particular weight of what he had given her. Not the facts, which were sad, but not unusual, but the trust required to speak them aloud, to this room, to her. He was not a man who trusted easily or spoke carelessly, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and this was what the moment contained. She would be glad, Eleanor said, of the roses coming back. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Eleanor." And it was the first time he had used her name, and they both understood, without discussing it, that something had shifted, a key turning in a lock, a door swinging a few degrees further open than it had been before. Saying his name back to him, Edmund felt like stepping off a ledge into air, terrifying, and then suddenly buoyant. "Edmund," she said, and he looked at her, with an expression that was no longer the almost of a smile, but the full, unguarded thing. And it was, she thought, the most beautiful sight in the house, which was saying something, given the view. It was Mrs. Alderton who warned her. On a Thursday in early December, the housekeeper knocked on Eleanor's door with an expression that had abandoned its customary watchfulness for something more direct and more alarmed. "There is a woman in the village," Mrs. Alderton said. "A Miss Bellamy. She's been there a fortnight, staying at the inn. She's been asking questions." Eleanor set down her pen. "What kind of questions?" Mrs. Alderton's mouth thinned. "The kind that assume answers. She's been asking about you specifically, about your history, your family, your—" a pause, "your worthiness. And she has brought, apparently, a young man named Hastings, who claims to have known you in the South." Eleanor was still for a moment. She knew the name. She had never spoken to a Mr. Hastings in her life, a fact that was, in its own way, clarifying. Miss Isabel Bellamy had been, until the autumn's engagement announcement, widely understood in certain circles of society to be the most likely candidate for Prince Edmund's hand. She was the daughter of a marquis, celebrated for her beauty, admired for her elegance, and accustomed, Eleanor suspected, to the world arranging itself to her preferences. Eleanor had never met her. She had read about her once in a society paper that had found its way to Ashmore House, a small mention in a list of celebrated beauties at a Kensington ball. She had forgotten it almost immediately, in the way that one forgets things that do not seem to pertain to one's life. It appeared the oversight had been premature. Eleanor sat with this information for the length of one quiet morning, turning it over the way she turned over household accounts, looking for the sum beneath the figures, the logic beneath the presentation. What Miss Bellamy wanted was not difficult to deduce. What she had brought to accomplish it was the old machinery of slander, reliable and ugly, requiring only a compliant instrument, in this case a young man of flexible memory and gambling debts, and a crowd willing to believe the worst of someone they did not know. Eleanor had no fear of the truth, because the truth was entirely on her side. What she feared, to the extent she feared anything, was the particular cruelty of a world that often preferred a beautiful lie to a plain truth, and that had been practicing this preference for long enough to have made it something of an art. The slander that emerged over the following fortnight was not, in itself, complicated. It was the old machinery, a man claiming impropriety, a letter of disputed authenticity, a whispered history of something shameful and unspecified. It moved through the local society with the efficiency of all rumors that have been carefully seeded, and it arrived at Callaway Hall in the form of a pointed note from a neighbor, a withdrawal of a dinner invitation, and finally, catastrophically, a scene at the assembly at the village hall in the 3rd week of December, to which the prince had escorted Eleanor, and at which Miss Bellamy had contrived to be present. She was, it was true, extraordinarily beautiful. She wore white and gold, and moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been trained, since childhood, to occupy the center of any gathering. She found Eleanor near the refreshment table, in the way of people who have planned a finding and are performing a discovery, and she said, in a carrying voice that was not quite loud enough to shout and not quite quiet enough to be private, "Miss Whitmore, I did not know you were acquainted with Mr. Hastings. He speaks of you quite warmly, I must say, given the circumstances." The room did not go entirely silent. It went the way rooms go when a significant thing has happened and everyone is pretending to talk about something else. Eleanor looked at Miss Bellamy for a moment. She looked at the white and gold and the perfect beauty of her, and she felt, not fury, but something cooler and more useful than fury. She felt the particular clarity that comes to people who have spent 30 years in the company of small cruelties and are no longer surprised by any of them. "I am not acquainted with Mr. Hastings," Eleanor said. "I have never spoken with him. I believe you are aware of this." Miss Bellamy smiled. "How strange. He seems to recall you very distinctly." "Then his memory," Eleanor said, "is performing a service his character is not." 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The room held its breath, and then across the crowded hall, past the neighbors and their polite averted gazes and their paused conversations and their careful indifference, Prince Edmund Callaway began to walk, not quickly, not dramatically, with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision and is in the process of carrying it out. He crossed the full length of the room. He passed Miss Bellamy without a glance. He stopped beside Eleanor and turned so that they were standing together facing the hall, and he looked at Miss Bellamy with the winter sky eyes at their flattest and most unequivocal, and he said, in a voice that carried clearly without being raised, "I am familiar with Mr. Hastings. He borrowed £600 from Gerald Ashmore's eldest son 4 years ago and has not repaid it. I have the record of the debt in my possession as of yesterday afternoon, and I am prepared to make it public at whatever juncture becomes necessary." He paused 1 beat. "I trust it will not become necessary." Miss Bellamy's colour had changed. The white and gold of her remained perfect, but the face above it had gone a shade that was not quite composed. "And as for my wife," Edmund said, and Eleanor felt the word land, felt it settle over her like something she had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting. "I would like to say for the clarity of this room that I chose her, not from charity, not from obligation, not because beauty was absent from my options." His gaze moved from Miss Bellamy to Eleanor, and the expression on his face was the open, full, unguarded smile that she had first seen in the library on the November evening, and it looked, in this room, in front of all these people, like a declaration of war and a peace treaty simultaneously. "I chose her because I watched her straighten a dying vase of flowers in a corridor when she thought no one was looking. Because she asked me a pointed question about fishing tariffs and then told me my counsel was wrong. Because she walked into a neglected garden and saw roses that everyone else had written off and did not say a word to me about them. She simply put on her gloves and got to work. Because she is the only person who has spoken to me in longer than I care to recall, as though I were a man and not a title." He paused. "I did not choose her, Miss Bellamy, in spite of the options. I chose her because I was paying attention." The room was absolutely still. Eleanor did not cry. She had learned a very long time ago that tears given to cruelty are a gift to the wrong person. She had rationed herself carefully over 30 years, and she did not spend what she had rationed on this moment, in this hall, in front of these people. She found his hand with hers. He closed his fingers around it without looking down, as though he had known she was going to reach for him, as though he had left his hand in exactly the right place. Miss Bellamy said nothing. She turned and made her way towards the door, the white and gold of her unchanged and perfect, and, in its perfection, somehow deeply diminished, the way bright things look diminished when the light that was making them bright goes suddenly somewhere else. Eleanor did not watch her go with triumph. She felt, in fact, the smallest and most inconvenient flicker of something like pity, for the woman who had been so certain of everything and had found certainty was not the same thing as being deserved. Pity, and then the sound of the room returning to itself, voices finding their level, and the warmth of a hand holding hers. The wedding was held in January, in the chapel on the grounds of Callaway Hall, with a small attendance that included Mrs. Alderton in an uncommonly fine hat, a hat that Eleanor had not previously known existed, and which suggested that somewhere in Mrs. Alderton's history there had been occasions that called for it, and cook who wept freely and made no apology for this, and a curious, bright-eyed young maid named Bess, who pressed a sprig of dried rosemary into Eleanor's hands at the door and said it was for luck, though they both suspected it was for love. Thomas the gardener stood at the back of the chapel in his Sunday coat and held his cap in both hands, which was, from Thomas, the approximate equivalent of a standing ovation. Sir Gerald came from the city, looking satisfied in the way of men who have arranged something and are prepared to accept the credit. Lady Whitmore came from Ashmore House wearing the expression of a woman who has found an outcome she had not planned for and is in the process of deciding to take credit for it. Cecily came in rose pink and sat in the third pew, and looked, Eleanor thought, with a brief and forgiving glance, not so much envious as bewildered, still, after all this time, trying to understand a calculation that had never been about calculation at all. Eleanor wished her well, quietly and without resentment, which was perhaps the most generous thing she could do, and was done without any awareness of its generosity. The officiant spoke of duty. Edmund beside her turned his head slightly and found her eye, and she saw, in his winter sky gaze, the quiet private amusement of a man who knows that duty had very little to do with it. She said the words. He said the words. The window behind the altar let in the January light, pale, clean, northern, honest, and it fell across her grey dress and made it silver. 1 year later, Callaway Hall was a different house. This is not a metaphor, though it is also a metaphor. The dust covers had been removed throughout, packed away in the attic by a staff that had grown, gradually, as the house grew into itself. 11 staff becoming 17 as the rooms that had been closed were opened, as guests were invited and dinners were given, and the great hall was used again, not for lonely formal meals, but for the wide, warm, occasional chaos of a household that had stopped apologizing for being alive. There had been a dinner in September for the Northern Council, a long dinner for once, at which the newly implemented tiered tariff structure had been toasted by men who had opposed it twice, and were now, in the manner of men who discover they were wrong, particularly enthusiastic in their support. Eleanor had sat at Edmund's right hand and said very little, and eaten cook's best lamb, and smiled once to herself at her plate. Mrs. Alderton had not softened, precisely, but she had admitted, on a night in October when the wind was doing something impressive off the sea, that the house had been too quiet for too long, and that she had not realized this until it was no longer true. Eleanor had poured her a very small glass of the good brandy and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. The rose garden had come back. Not all at once. Roses are patient things, not given to dramatic gestures, but by June there had been enough bloom to fill the window boxes on the eastern side, and by August the old stone bench was surrounded entirely, and a gardener named Thomas, who had said almost nothing to Eleanor for 7 months, had presented her, one Tuesday morning without announcement, with a cut stem of a deep red climbing rose that he said was a variety that had not bloomed in that garden for at least a decade. She had put it in water in the library window, and it had outlasted all reasonable expectation. Edmund was in the library, as he often was. The library had become the room they both gravitated toward, drawn by its fire and its books and the round table that had been moved there from the sitting-room, where it now held the evening's tea-things and occasionally a game of cards and once, memorably, the plans for a new system of tiered fishing tariffs that Eleanor had drafted and Edmund had taken, with an expression she recognized as the precursor to the almost smile to the Northern Council. The Council had passed it on the 3rd attempt. She had not said anything about this. She had merely poured his tea with a particular efficiency that he had learned to read. Their daughter was 4 months old and asleep in the room above the library. She had her father's grey eyes and her mother's dark hair and an expression, in sleep, of a person who has arrived exactly where she intended to be. Eleanor sat across from Edmund in the library, in the firelight, with the November dark beyond the windows and the sea making its distant sound, and she was not grey any more. She wore a deep twilight blue that he had chosen, 6 months past, from a merchant's samples, holding it up against the northern light and saying, without ceremony, this one, and the merchant had wrapped it without comment, and Eleanor had worn it and found that it was the colour of the sky at exactly the moment before dark becomes genuine night, when the last of the day's light is still held, impossibly, in the air. He looked up from his papers and found her eye across the table. She had learned, over the year, that he had a dozen ways of looking at her. There was the direct, considered look of the corridor, attentive, assessing. There was the winter sky look of the difficult evenings when the weight of the title and the council and the inherited grief pressed in, and he needed only the fact of her presence. There was the look that was the full smile's antecedent, arriving before the smile with a particular quality of warmth, as though the warmth preceded the expression. And there was this look, the evening one, the quiet and unhurried and entirely private look that said nothing that needed saying and everything that mattered. She thought, not for the first time, of all the years she had spent invisible. All the mornings she had descended the stairs at Ashmore House to pour tea that was taken without thanks, to manage accounts that no one noticed, to mend things and oversee things and sustain things in the relentless, unremarked way of a woman who had been told, in 100 small and cumulative ways, that this was the extent of what she was for. She did not regret those years with bitterness. They had made her useful, and she valued being useful. But she looked at them now from the other side of something, from the library of Callaway Hall with its fire and its rose in the window and its man reading his papers and glancing up to find her across the room. And she understood that usefulness had never been the point. It had been a way of surviving until the point arrived. He had not, as it turned out, been lucky to find her. He had simply been paying attention. When her eyes filled, she was surprised by it, not by the emotion, which had been building for a year in the sealed chambers of herself, but by the fact that it chose this moment, the ordinary Tuesday evening, the familiar firelight, the sound of the sea. Not the assembly hall, not the chapel. This. He looked up from his papers and saw, and he did not speak, because he had learned, as she had, the value of silence used correctly. He simply set down his papers and reached across the small round table, and she put her hand in his. And the tears came quietly, the way all genuinely earned things come, without drama, without performance, with only the simple and staggering weight of being, at last, entirely and irrevocably seen. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.